all our friends in English and our ESU members who are here tonight. It's indeed a pleasure to welcome you on this Sunday evening, a very cold evening in Brisbane. And it's our special pleasure to welcome our friend in English, a wonderful friend that we enjoy his company so much here at the English Speaking Union, and also his support in his invaluable contribution to our work with the English Speaking Union. So, Emeritus Professor Roland Sussex, thank you so much for being here tonight. We've been waiting for this evening for some time. I mean, I know Shakespeare is 400 years since his demise, and a lot's happened in that time, but didn't he teach us a lot? So, Rolly, as much as we love listening to you on the radio every day, that special word that you have every day, here at the English Speaking Union, we so appreciate your contribution to our invaluable work worldwide. I think Rolly tonight he's handed out a little teaser so that we can all get a bit of a flavour of what he's going to speak about tonight for the language of Shakespeare. I think if Shakespeare were alive today, he'd be very proud of our Roland Sussex and his contribution to many of the words that Shakespeare developed and used over the many years of his life. I think Roland, he was probably not as old as us when he died.
No.
Was that right?
No.
Yes, he lived
somewhat short.
A very short life, but a very powerful and one that's had a profound effect on the English language ever since, just as you have, Rolly, to our everyday lives these days that we enjoy every minute we have with you. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the English Speaking Union Queensland, Roland Sussex.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, everyone. I love this place for many reasons. One is that when you go to the loo, it says gentlemen. This is something that Shakespeare would have appreciated, because I want to write underneath bounders and go elsewhere. Shakespeare loved playing with language, and I'm going to be playing with language somewhat this evening as well. It's 400 years since he died, and so this year there has been a huge amount of memorialising about Shakespeare, about the man, about his work, and about his legacy. And it's very difficult in the middle of all that to find new things to say. I have, I think, one fact to offer you this evening, which I shall trot out in due course with some pride. But a lot of what I say tonight reflects the fact that it's almost impossible to be original when talking about Shakespeare. He is probably the most written about writer of all, and not just in English, right? Because he has been translated into, the full works are available in over 30 languages, and major parts of his work are available in 80 languages, including Swahili. So this is someone who's gone much farther than the bounds of English and has taken his work into areas where it would have been impossible for him to guess in his lifetime that he would have arrived. So what I'm going to offer you today is a very personal view of his language and why it is so important to us in the 20th century. The handout is my way of saying that I hate PowerPoint. And PowerPoint stews your brains and causes you not to think. And I have on occasion delivered a lecture with the PowerPoint from one lecture and the content from another. And after a while my students got the point that they should not pay too much attention to the PowerPoint. I wanted to talk to them and they wanted them to listen. So this is something for you to take away. A whole series of bits and pieces of information which are part of the background of what I've got to say tonight, but also some of the facts that I think you'd like to pursue further on the web. There's a lot of material on the web which you can get on this material. So I want to start with thinking a bit about what English was like in Shakespeare's time. For us nowadays, we are sitting in the middle of the world language. And there is no doubt at all that English for the time being has won. And it is used by more people to do more things than any other language has ever done on the planet, or for the next 50 years or so is likely to do. And that means that I can make predictions as well as I will, because I won't be here in 50 years. And my view is that for the moment English is it. And so we need to work out how Shakespeare has come together to shape most of what we have. Now, in Shakespeare's day, English was totally different. They didn't really have a grammar of English. Now, we have hundreds. But in his day, if you look at the sheet, you'll find that in 1586 Bullocker had done something called a pamphlet. Right? They were trying to sketch some of the aspects of English. And there had been an earlier one written in 1534 by Lilly. It was called the Rudimenta Grammatices. You write about English in Latin, because Latin was the language of scholarship. And if you could write about English in Latin, you were dignifying English with the language of prestige. So this was quite important. Bullocher's pamphlet was important. Also, I think very, very significant are the fact that Caxton had set up his press in 1476. And the person who took over from him with the marvellous name of Wynkyn de Warder. By the time he'd finished being Caxton's printer, they'd put out 800 different titles. Now, if you imagine what books were like before that, they were copied by monks manually, that they were expensive, the distribution was very restricted to small people who had lots of money or who were in the church. With printing, it became possible to distribute texts to lots of people, and literacy took a sudden kick upwards. So that this is part of the background. You know, that we had, if you like, a written source of English available to people to see that their language was actually used and written. Right? Among the first things that Caxton printed were the Bible, Wycliffe's Bible. All right. Dictionaries. They didn't have a proper dictionary of English at all. In 1582, Mulcaster had produced something he called his Elementary. 8,000 words just presented with their spellings. It wasn't thought necessary to give definitions, but he wanted to list the words that English people ought to know in order to use the language. Right, this is so different from where we are today. And in 1604, Cawdrey, this is in Shakespeare's time, right, produced the Table Alphabetical. I like the double L at the end, of 2,500 words. And again, this was a list of words, and he had to justify why he put them in alphabetical order. This was something rather revolutionary in his day. You know, there was no established pattern of listing words in a dictionary. So the Table Alphabetical was breaking new ground. The Bible, of course, was there. Wycliffe had done his big Bible in 1384. The Book of Common Prayer came out in 1549 and was very important. Tyndall, one of my personal favourites, had produced his Bible in 1536, but they strangled him and burnt him at the stake and distributed his ashes that they might not reassemble on Judgment Day. And all because he dared to produce a Bible in English. Right? Now remember, Luther's Bible was not far before that, and I carry Luther's Bible and Tyndall's Bible on my laptop and read them in foreign airports, and people look over my shoulder and say, "What's that stuff?" In their day, these were revolutionary documents, because the notion that you could consume the scriptures directly from your own language was something new. Okay? And of course the King James came out in 1611, one of the big books of English for which I have enormous affection and respect. An odder fact that I came across is that 1576 is the opening of the first theatre in London. That's strange. Before that, of course, there were travelling theatres, right? And there were travelling groups of players who would perform from the back of wagons and things. But the first proper theatre, and Shakespeare arrived just at the moment when these were coming in. Of the writers, well, Chaucer had died in 1400, and the Canterbury Tales were quite well known. Sidney and Spencer were producing their rather carefully crafted English. Okay? And Marlowe had done Tamburlaine. I have a quotation from Marlowe in a moment. But even more important, I think, was the inkhorn controversy, which was typical of the century. Inkhorns was the place where you dipped your pen to get ink to write with, and the inkhorn controversy had to do with where the new words were coming from. Because in Shakespeare's day, English was very much a spoken language, but you would hear around you lots of French, lots of Italian, massive amounts of Latin in the schools, and it's likely that Shakespeare did year 12 in Latin. You know, you taught Latin for education. He knew some Greek, although one of his contemporaries said that he only knew a little bit of Greek. But he had a smattering of Spanish, and English was like a sponge. It was starting to suck up words from everywhere. It didn't have norms the way we know them, and it had no regular points of reference the way we do by looking at the dictionaries or our manuals of usage. So I've actually missed out one important thing from my handout. In Othello, we find not only the word impede, but also Shakespeare included expede. Now, impede is to stop something happening. To expede is to hasten it. And think of expedition. He did it with all expedition, meaning with all haste, all right? Expede was one of Shakespeare's words which didn't persist. Impede, of course, did. But when you think about it, expede, impede, both of the prefixes are well known in English. They generate hundreds of words each. So why not have a parallel? It's a bit like in Indian English. You can not only postpone something, you can prepone it as well, which is something that Shakespeare would have appreciated, because in his day, words were there to be created and played with, and the roots were available for members of his generation to exploit. And if you could create a new word which was successful, great. The two big plays which were successful in the years before Shakespeare were Kyd's Spanish tragedy, with beautiful, vivid language of 1592, and the Tamburlaine the Great of Marlowe, which was 1588. And I've given you a little bit here to give you a flavour of Marlowe. This is the beginning of Tamburlaine. Brother Cosroe, I find myself aggrieved, yet insufficient to express the same. For it requires a great and thundering speech, right? Different rhythm from Shakespeare. I know you have a better wit than I. This doesn't run off the tongue the way Shakespeare does. And Marlowe, in fact, produced in Tamburlaine some really marvellous, high-level, dramatic English, but it was not the sort of thing that runs off the tongue the way Shakespeare does. So Shakespeare himself, well, he produced perhaps 38 plays. We're not entirely certain exactly how many. There's some difficulty about how many, but it is pretty clear to me and to the majority of modern people who think about this that Shakespeare was not written by Marlowe and was not written by Bacon. And part of the evidence lies on the dialectal words, which are in his plays. I'll come to that in a moment. There were 154 sonnets and 2 longer poems, totaling 904,000 words. Now, one man in a writing lifetime, that's a lot. It beats the King James Bible, which is into the 830,000s. And I've got all of Shakespeare on my disk, and I can do searches on it using the usual tools. And you can do a lot of interesting research on Shakespeare, and on the King James for that matter, by using ordinary search engines. You put it into Microsoft Word, and you can find out things. His vocabulary, there's a big controversy about how big it was. Some people say over 30,000 words. Probably if you count the roots that he used, it's about 20,000. Which for his day was a lot. And a lot of those were original. And when you compare it to, say, the French drama of Racine, which was in the 17th century, Racine wrote Berenice using only 1,200 words. In other words, a very rigorously controlled classical norm, which had very clear ideas about what language was in and what was out. As we will see in a moment, Shakespeare's idea of what was in was much wider. But 20,000 headwords or roots. Of those, and again we're in the area of controversy, about 1,720 were neologisms. These were words which are recorded in Shakespeare for the first time. It does not mean that he invented them, because it is equally possible that he picked up words already in current usage and was the first person to plonk them down into writing. Okay? So that when we talk about originality in Shakespeare, I think we are in murky waters. Certainly he invented a lot. Certainly he gave first creative expression to a lot of vocabulary. But, and here comes my only original observation, I have the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations, and Shakespeare occupies 1/7 of all of the quotations listed in that dictionary. 14%. One man. All right, who lived 400 years ago. He had an absolutely phenomenal ear for the combinations of English words that would be sticky and would stay in our memories and would attract us to imitate and use his words again. And I have a lovely piece which I will read to you in a moment from Bernard Levin. In fact, I might even read it now because it's so good. Wait till I find it. Levin was a journalist who worked with the London newspapers, and he did a piece which picks up the words of Shakespeare, and it goes like this. I'm going to read it all with apologies to him. If you cannot understand my argument and declare it's Greek to me, you are quoting Shakespeare. If you claim to be more sinned against than sinning, you are quoting Shakespeare. If you recall your salad days, you're quoting Shakespeare. If you act more in sorrow than in anger, if your wish is father to the thought, if your lost property has vanished into thin air, you are quoting Shakespeare. If you have ever refused to budge an inch or suffered from green-eyed jealousy, if you have played fast and loose, if you have been tongue-tied, a tower of strength, hoodwinked, or in a pickle, if you have knitted your brows, made a virtue of necessity, insisted on fair play, slept not one wink, stood on ceremony, danced attendance on your lord and master, laughed yourself into stitches, had short shrift, cold comfort, or too much of a good thing, if you have seen better days, or lived in a fool's paradise, why, be that as it may, the more fool you, for it is a foregone conclusion that you are, as good luck would have it, quoting Shakespeare. If you think it is early days and clear out bag and baggage, if you think it is high time and that this is the long and the short of it, if you believe that the game is up and that the truth will out, even if it involves your own flesh and blood, if you lie low till the crack of doom because you suspect foul play, if you have your teeth set on edge at one fell swoop, without rhyme or reason, then to give the devil his due, if the truth were known, for surely you have a tongue in your head, you are quoting Shakespeare. Even if you bid me good riddance and send me packing, if you wish I was dead as a doornail, if you think I am an eyesore, a laughing-stock, the devil incarnate, a stony-hearted villain, bloody-minded, or a blinking idiot, then, by Jove, oh Lord, tut, for goodness sake, what the dickens, but me no buts, it's all one to me, you are quoting Shakespeare. Isn't that a marvellous piece? Bernard Levin is no longer with us, I envy him that. There is one mistake. Shakespeare never wrote but me no buts. I shall tell you why in a moment. And I know because I've checked all of it. And I didn't read all of it, I did it on the computer. All right. Shakespeare's life was remarkably incomplete. He was born in 1654. His father was a glover, possibly illiterate because he signed his name with an X. He went to school at Stratford-on-Avon where he learnt some Latin and Greek. He married Anne Hathaway in 1582. He was then 18 and she 26, and their daughter was born 8 months after they were married. So clearly Shakespeare and Anne had a little enjoyment beforehand. He went to London at a date we're not sure of, probably in the late 1580s, and became not only a sonneteer but a playwright. He produced about a play every 6 months, which is fair going. And I can imagine him sitting in the back wings of the Globe, scribbling like mad, with the producer waiting to grab the sheets as they came up his pen to have someone copy them out so that they could go and rehearse them. He wrote fast. Dean Ing, who was once the Dean of St. Paul's in London, once noted that literature is best when it is half a trade and half an art. I think he was thinking of Dickens. And certainly Dickens producing episodes to be printed and then sent over on the boat over to America is part of this. Shakespeare was very much almost a journeyman writer, but amazingly prolific, quick, sure, and he went ongoing until 1612, 4 years before his death, when he returned to Stratford, bought a house, planned to retire and live the life of a gentleman, and died 4 years later, which showed that he should have kept on writing. He is, as I said, the most written about writer that we've got, and I think the jaw-dropping fact about him is that in such a short time he produced so much that was so good with hardly a dud among them. There are some plays which people say, oh, this isn't quite as good as Hamlet and Othello and Macbeth, but as people say, well, he's full of cliches. Well, he's full of cliches because he wrote them. And as Bernard Levin shows you, these are now part of our current language in English. Let's have a look at the vocabulary, the 20,000 words that he used, and the about 1,700 neologisms. About 8.6% of his total vocabulary use was possibly new, together with the new combinations of words. There is, of course, no way whether we know that these were his own coinings, because he may well have picked up words that others were using and was the first person to write them down. And you've got to remember also that none of his plays were printed in his lifetime. And the reason for that was that if they'd been printed, they'd have been pirated by someone else who would have put on rival performances. They didn't have copyright in those days. And so as soon as you printed your stuff, someone else got it and were busy setting up to make money out of your work. What is more, since the first folios are 1623, Shakespeare never oversaw the production and printing of his own work. And in fact, in those days, writers very seldom did. The first writer in English before he went blind was Milton. And that's quite a few years later. So that the printer would print what he thought was a fair version, and if he didn't like some words or they didn't fit in the line, he'd chop them out. Printers were their own fair game, and they kind of left a lot of texts in a state where we're not quite sure. Shakespeare also had some unsuccessful neologisms, which we'll come to on the sheet, but I think looking at his words, let's have a look at the bottom of the first sheet now. He was very much fond of wordplay and puns, and he produced this monster of 27 letters, I practiced this before and it won't come out, honorificabilitatitudinibus, which means people who are able to receive honours. It's a bit of Latin, it's the ablative plural, it's by, with, from, in, or to the people who were able to do this. And obviously his listeners would have known enough Latin to decode it and make some fun out of it. But again, he was not beyond poking fun at people. He was not beyond vulgar language, although it's fairly restrained in his works. Hamlet and Ophelia, Hamlet talks about lying between a maiden's legs, and poor old Ophelia sitting there saying, what on earth is this character on about? And when he says to her, get thou to a nunnery, in Shakespeare's day, a nunnery was not only a nunnery, but it was also a brothel. And which one he meant, we don't know, but he was obviously playing on an ambiguity. And Ophelia had a bad deal. I mean, she was really not. And as Partridge, now Partridge was the person who did the Dictionary of Unconventional English, our first real dictionary of colloquialisms. He was a Kiwi who spent some time in Brisbane before he went to live in England. And Hamlet is talking to Ophelia, and he says, she asks, what is troubling you, my lord? And he says, nothing. Now, according to Partridge, that is an O thing. And as far as the O, you need to think of something round. Shakespeare never used the F word. By the way, he never split an infinitive either. But he never used the F word, but he used the French version of it. Pistol says a foutre for the world, and the French word for the F word is foutre. No? So that Shakespeare was, if you like, drawing on the bilingual capacities of his audience to avoid, now there was a censor around at the time who was looking at things which particularly were disrespectful of the crown or too vulgar to go on the stage. I think if Shakespeare had used the F word, which was certainly around in his time, he might have got into trouble, so he used the French one. And he's kind of thumbing his nose at everybody and saying, if you know this, you and I will share a little dirty joke. Dialects were important to him, and this is one of the reasons why we can be fairly confident that Marlowe and Bacon were not involved, because the word varmint, for example, is a Warwickshire version, which later went to America. The Americans talk about varmints. And I think this shows that this is not the sort of thing that Marlowe would have countenanced. His language was high tragic language. Right? Shakespeare was quite keen on range, and in fact he includes in his plays, as you'll remember, there is not only high tragic language, but there are also the history plays, which are more narrative. There are the comedies, which are much more light-hearted. Okay? And within the tragedies, there are things like the grave digger in Hamlet and the porter in Macbeth. Now, Voltaire, the French dramatist, was an Anglophile, spent a lot of time in England escaping the French secret police. And he said that Shakespeare was the world's greatest dramatist. He said, if you want to do philosophy, you do it in French. If you want to do poetry, you do it in Italian because of Dante. If you want to do tragedy, you write it in English. But he cleaned up Shakespeare by taking out the porter and the grave digger and a lot of other bits which he thought were not consistent with the dignity of a tragic play. Now, a little bit later in English, of course, the Augustans were very clear about the unity of tone and the necessity for having language which was consistently respectful of the genre of tragedy which went back to the Greeks. Shakespeare thumbed his nose at the whole lot. And so he had the grave digger in Hamlet, the porter in Macbeth, and he mixed them up something chronic. And obviously loved doing it. Right. Now, there is no doubt at all that he could write with the best of them in the romantic genre and to the romantic stereotypes of his day, but doing it much better than anyone else. Sonnet number 18, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Beautiful, right? So thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaf has all too short a date. That's marvellous. And with it we get the iambic pentameter, de-dum, 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 but not as mechanically as that. He manages to string the syllables together in a way that rolls off the tongue. There are very few lines in Shakespeare that are hard to say, because he understands what things, and words like terrorism, which bothered President Bush, say, do not occur in Shakespeare, and he doesn't use them like that either.
Robert, can I just ask a minute, what sort of accent would have been used then?
If you look on the web, you'll find David Crystal, who's a very well-known English linguist who's done 100 books on language. He and his son actually act out part of Shakespeare's plays in the language of London, with a tincture of Warwickshire added on. In other words, Shakespeare would have spoken a rather provincial sort of English. And in those days, provincial English was okay. A bit later, being a provincial was a bad thing, and people tried to avoid it. Okay?
Understood. If he spoke equally understood.
Well, you would have understood a lot, not all of it. I mean, references like the nunnery being a brothel we would have missed entirely. And there are quite a few uses of words where the senses have changed quite a bit. On the whole, though, we'd have been not too bad. If you look at this for this piece on the web with David Crystal, Professor David Crystal, it's real well worth looking at. I did, however, want to give you something rather different, because we know too much of Shakespeare too well, and so we tend to fall into veneration mode. Because this is lovely, familiar, beautiful, respectful stuff that we know and appreciate, and which we often learnt at school. He wrote a sonnet which was sometimes called the anti-sonnet. It's number 130 of 154, and I want to go through it with you because it shows that he is able to poke fun at himself and at people who were imitating him at the same time. Does anyone know the Mozart musical joke? This is a bit the same. And Mozart wrote a piece of music to satirize those who were imitating Mozart. This is Shakespeare writing to satirize those who are imitating Shakespeare. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Right, now in those days, of course, your mistress had eyes like the sun. She walked like as if she were flying. She had skin like gossamer and hair like whatever. And there were a whole series of accepted stereotype images which were used. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why, then her breasts are dun. If hair be wires, black wires grow on her head. You wonder, why is he writing this stuff? I have seen roses damasked, red and white, that's a conventional phrase, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes there is more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. Mistress, by the way, is just his wife, all right? It is not anything else. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And then he turns the whole thing upside down. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. In other words, she's the real deal, and I love her lots, and there's no one like her. Now this is very clever. This is getting right out of the skin of the stereotypes of his day and showing that it is possible to write almost against yourself and then to undo that in the last two lines. Right. And I wanted to give you this to take away and think about, because you think for the first 12 lines this is disrespectful, unkind, nasty, and sort of all sorts of things which nowadays would not be allowed. And then the last two lines he just says, this lady is it, and I love her greatly. Isn't that beautiful? Yeah. Let's have a look at the neologisms now, because I've had a look at most of the 1720 of them. Some of them were foreign. Alligator. Now remember, this was the period of great exploration. Columbus got to America in 1492, and the great explorers were coming back from the New World with stories of fabled animals and things that they'd found. So alligator was from Spanish, anchovy was from Spanish, bandit was from Italian. castigate, right? Taken from Latin roots. Dexterously, dexter is the Latin word for right. And so dexterous had been in Latin, come to us through French. Denote, hostile, and even zany. Right? Now these were words which he borrowed from foreign languages. They would almost certainly have been familiar to his audience, or they would have had the wit to work out from the context what he was saying. And it may well be that once these words occurred in Shakespeare's play, they took off and became, from that beginning, as popular as they are nowadays. The second sort of word of creation that he was involved in was word formation. Now, word formation is when you take a suffix or a prefix and add it onto something, a root, a familiar root, okay? So, assassin was already known. It was a word, hashashim, in Arabic, which means someone who consumes hashish. And people who did assassinations were supposed to be high on pot. Now, assassination as a noun, right, he did a lot of this, making a new part of speech out of these things. Outbreak. Break was known, out was known, put them together, outbreak, all right, a new word. Outgrow. He has quite a few with similar prefixes. Outweigh. And with the suffix remorseless. Certainly the word remorse was known, French remords, right? Remorseless, you put a good English suffix on the end, remorseless. Giving us the modern bastardized form of irregardless, by the way, which has got too many negatives. The third one he was involved in was combining roots. And this is interesting because he takes two roots from different areas and jams them together. And oddly enough, the combinations were astonishingly frequent and successful. So, honey-tongued. Now notice, honey-tongued, ah. There's the same vowel in both. This is called an echo phrase. It's a bit like a rhyme, but it's not as precise as a rhyme, where you have to have the stressed syllable and anything that follows, the consonant. Now, he doesn't do that. So, honey-tongued, ladybird is one of his. Okay? Lady beetle in other parts of the world. Lackluster, lackluster. And he is very, very conscious of the musical properties of repeated sounds. And again, from somewhere, this genius of combination produces things which we will remember. Moonbeam. Okay? Newfangled, that would have struck me as much more recent, but it's Shakespearean. Nimble-footed. Okay? Newfangled, nimble-footed, we have a pattern in New English nowadays of putting ed on the end of things and making a new adjective. He was there 400 years before. Pale-faced, sorry I have a misprint, and shooting star. And finally, conversion. Conversion is when you take a word and use it as a novel part of speech without adding anything. You see, if you want to make a verb in English nowadays, you tend to go IZE, all right? Hospital, hospitalize. On the other hand, if you say oil is a noun, but I'm going to oil my bicycle, that makes it into a verb. And that is called conversion. People say that, you know, there is too much conversion in English at the moment. He was at it a long time before we were. So, to cow, meaning to make someone feel scared, all right? Discontent is a noun. Now is the summer of our discontent. Huh? Isn't that a line? Oh, I love it. Humour, to humour someone. A lot of these are verbs. That's why I've put the part of speech after them. Because he's instead of saying, you know, to bring me into good humour or whatever, taken the noun, make it into a verb. To petition someone. To drug someone. To forward something. Now, forward, of course, is a preposition or an adverb. He uses this as a verb, meaning to carry it forward. To hurry, which used to be a noun until he used it as a verb. And to rival, which he uses both as a verb and an adjective, whereas before it was a noun. He did have some failures, and it's interesting to look at these because they are in form like the ones I've just given you as the successful ones, all right? So, wenchless. Someone who is deprived of female company is wenchless, all right? A very useful word, come on. All right? Thoughten, making a, making a new verb by putting "en" on the end. That one didn't work. Successantly, razorable, questant, right? Question, questant, seeking for something. Overstink, I think we could use that nowadays. Overgreen, omittance, meaning to omit something. Offendress, a lady who does it rather than a man. Oathable, something which makes you break out into bad language. Disliken, there's another one of those en ones. Ex-suffocate, that's an adjective which means frivolous. Compulsative, and betray. Now, looking at them from the point of view of how they're put together, they could have succeeded with the neologisms that I've listed above. They didn't. Several of them seem to us to feel a little bit inept, uncomfortable, all right? But some of them are certainly okay. No, they should have succeeded. And there is one, which I hope I can find in my notes here, which I left out of the notes and I needed to tell you about, which has to do with incarnadine. The word incarnadine is only used in Macbeth. The multitudinous seas incarnadine. And he's, in other words, making the seas red like flesh and blood, because the carnadine, the carn is the word for flesh, all right? And then he says, and make the grey ones green. Make the grey ones green. Now, he's used this terribly, terribly high language, multitudinous seas incarnadine. Long roots taken from Latin. And then he thinks, whoops, some people mightn't understand that, to make the green ones red. So he uses simple, direct, concrete, monosyllabic Germanic words to say the same thing. He knew very well what he was about and what was likely to cause problems. He didn't say but me no buts, by the way. I have been right through the entire Shakespeare work using word processing software. And so Levin had it wrong. But you see, one of the features of Shakespeare is that there are things which we believe he did say, but he didn't. But they persist as if they were. But he did say uncle me no uncles. And uncle me no uncles, of course, is turning a noun into a verb, but with the same kind of effect. In other words, don't go on and on to me about uncles, all right? I know about uncles. Uncle me no uncles. And so he loved the short, pungent phrase, the way of you know, working with words and to make them work with you. Yeah, here's the phrase now. This is from Macbeth. Whence is that knocking? How is it with me when every noise appalls me? What hands are here? Ha, they pluck out mine eyes. Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? He's stabbed someone. No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine. It will make them red, making the green one red. I had a slight misprint before. He knows what he's about very, very well. By the way, there was a lovely story about Macbeth. They had a rather bad provincial actor doing Macbeth who said, "Is this a bloody dagger that I see before me?" And someone in the back of the stall said, "No, you budger, it's a knife." All right, let's step back a little bit and have a look at what I've shown you. I mean, look, I could go on for hours. I mean, this man is full of so many wondrous things to think about and marvel at. And in particular, to work out how he landed so often on a felicitous phrase which would persist, or a very felicitous word in context which people would remember. The Augustans, a little bit later under Dr. Johnson, remember 1755 is Dr. Johnson's big dictionary, talked about the unity of tone. And they got this idea from the French, who got it from Latin, who got it from Greek. And the idea was that tragedy had a dignity which one should not besmirch by having low language, dialectal language, vulgar language, and you certainly shouldn't have stinking characters like the porter and the gravedigger. There is, if any of you ever see it, by the way, there is a black and white Russian film of Hamlet where the gravedigger, you can almost smell him on the screen. Shakespeare might well have been written in Russian, I shall tell you in a minute. All right. Now, the whole idea about the unity of tone had to do with the consistency of production. Shakespeare was not into that. He was writing for everybody. And so there was a bit of bawdy stuff for those who like dirty jokes, and there was a bit of lower class words for the people, you know, who came to see this. And remember, the audiences at the Globe were very much mixed up. There's a lot of the jovial. No, the comedies are a lot of fun, and he loves being in there. And dialectal things like varmint. I think, no, he was I mean, this range is quite extraordinary, because out of it he made works which hang together and which do not strike us as being full of heterogeneous pieces which are fighting against each other. We take them as being part of one. Nowadays, who do we have that's making new words? Well, the American Dialect Society estimates that 15,000 words are added to core English vocabulary every year. And these are words that everybody recognizes and you know, want to put in the dictionary. But the total vocabulary of English is probably well over 1 billion words. No one can count it, because when you take all of the technical words, all of the labs, all of the bits of colloquial English which are used in Holland and you know, France and other places, there's no way we'll do it. It's absolutely lost. On the other hand, we have things like J.K. Rowling, who's sold 450 million copies of her books for about $6 billion. Now, that's a bit more than Shakespeare. But she has things like the Hogwarts and the Muggles, which have become, I think, part of modern English. And certainly the Daleks have been exterminated, have become part of our English, certainly part of my children's English. We have Roald Dahl, a children's author. This is interesting. Creating words which children love, like fizz-whizzing and snosbury and scrumdiddly-umptious and guzzle-swiped and swashboggling. And we have, I think, neologisms like that are popping up all over the place in English. English is now, it's always been a flypaper language. Wherever it goes, it picks up stuff, you know, and it picks up Malayan words like running amok, and it goes to China and it picks up of words like tea, which is cha in Chinese, and so on. And it's been, I think, the great gatherer of bits and pieces. Unlike the French, who have spent 400 years since the Academy trying to purify their language, English has spent all of the time trying to create a great big muck heap out of which we can create literature. And Shakespeare would, I think, have been quite confident with that. The other proof of his success is that he is quoted and misquoted and unquoted in all sorts of places and in ways which we wouldn't have anticipated. Uncle Me No Uncles is part of it, and I think that, you know, this shows us that he was wider and broader and not limited in the way that the French drama of his days were. Sorry, I'm trying to find a piece of paper which I want, and I'll come to it in a moment. We find things like, now, to boldly go where no man has gone before. To boldly go, da-da-da-da. That's an iambic pentameter, isn't it? That's Shakespeare. Boldly to go, da-da-da-da. That doesn't feel right. To go boldly, you know, it's not comfortable. And so as long as the adverb is shortish, you can split an infinitive and it feels right. And in fact, David Crystal, whom I mentioned before, said quite clearly that in his version of understanding how this works, we will tend naturally to gravitate towards an iambic pentameter as the natural rhythm of English because of what Shakespeare did. Okay. In other words, he established a particular form of verse, and remember that not all English words are didum. Right? We have a lot of monosyllables, we have a lot of words like egress and ingress which are stressed on the first syllable. And yet he established that in English we are comfortable with da-dum, 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 da-dum. Right? That is quite an achievement, which is not to do with the words themselves, and it's not really to do with the grammar of what he's doing. It's got to do with the way in which words are woven around the rhythms that he provides for them. And that was really clever. It's hard, in fact, not to use Shakespeare in everyday speech. That piece of Bernard Levin that I quoted to you showed that all of these common phrases, you know, Shakespeare is full of cliches. Well, yeah, he wrote them. This is why we talk in cliches. And so in all of this, I think we find a high-spirited, extremely amiable man, able to mix registers, able to reach out, to wrap his mind around all sorts of English, and to do it with an extraordinarily effective and, I think, amiable way. And if you want to ask someone who's going to come and join you at dinner, Shakespeare would be my #1 choice. Because, but again, as I was saying to some of our guests before, there was a period of Doctor Who where he and his assistant turned up, and the assistant, of course, being female, was very attractive, and Shakespeare reached across the table and tried to kiss her, and she said, "You may be a famous poet, but my God, you've got awful breath." I was, and I can't find it. If I can find it, I will do it for you, but if I can't, I won't. I was going to finish by quoting to you Shakespeare in Russian, because Shakespeare was translated into Russian by none other than Boris Pasternak, who is, of course, the author of Dr. Zhivago. And the Russian film of Hamlet, which I mentioned before, you could swear that the play had been written in Russian in the first place. As I said, 30 plus languages where it has already been done, and I can't find the rotten thing, and I'll have to leave it for you for another day. But the fact that Shakespeare sounds like Shakespeare in other languages is quite weird. No, he's been done many times into German, say, because Shakespeare is venerated in German. And I have read versions of Shakespeare in Czech, in Polish, and in Russian. And somehow, in spite of the very different characteristics of these languages, there is something ineluctably Shakespearean which comes through. So that is really why I venerate Shakespeare, together with Tyndall and one or two others in the history of English. He set our language on a course which I think has been very profitable, but it's also part of the way we think about the way we speak and what we do. And this is now the language of, well, 450 million people who have it as a first language, but probably 2 billion people worldwide who use English in some way or another for commerce, for diplomacy, for travel and tourism. And the language of Shakespeare you will now hear all over the globe. I have heard people quoting Shakespeare in pretty well perfect English in the back blocks of China. And this is the way in which he has managed to make it. Thank you. And I am going to try and find for you, if I brought it with me, I had it carefully laid out, Shakespeare in Russian, because in Russian there's something special. Anne.
I'll say a few words while you have a look.
Yeah. I don't think it's here. Go on.
Do you want some questions?
Sorry? Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yes, at the back.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful. I was thinking as you were speaking, I wonder, considering the poem, the sonnet that you quoted,
Yeah.
I take it that you feel very comfortable with playfulness
Yes.
and disrespect that Shakespeare, can offer himself.
Okay.
I wonder how you feel about modern productions of Shakespeare. For example, just even most recently, Much Ado About Nothing at QDC, which was pretty, pretty bawdy.
Yeah.
And truly, the students, I don't know, the night that I went, there were so many students in the audience, they were cheering as if it was a pantomime half the time.
Yeah.
It really struck me that night that, in a sense, the disrespect for making it perfect and so on.
Okay.
So your observation.
All right. I wasn't there. I wish I had been. But for my money, I think Shakespeare was, look, he was into vulgar language. And the fact that he quotes the worst word in French in one of his plays, I think, shows very clearly that he was comfortable with this mixing of the very high and the very low. And attempts by, not only Voltaire to clean up Shakespeare, but also of generations recently to put him on a sort of pedestal and venerate him. His word capacity and his creativity are venerable in that sense. But I think he would have found this a little bit discomforting, possibly even inappropriate. He'd have said, but didn't you get the other bits, because the other bits are part of the total picture, And he was a full-on user of English across the entire range. Yeah.
Rolly, if Shakespeare skillfully exploited the resources of the English language, could it be said that quite a few political and media personalities of our own time exploited?
What?
Exploited?
Oh, right, yes. He would have probably received that with acclamation, yes. But again, remember that in his day, the language did not have the norms that we know them today. And that experimentation, creativity, failing, with a new neologism were quite expected. They were quite happy about this. So that instead of having a series of norms where this word's in the dictionary and is okay, that one is out and it's not, his language is porous. And it doesn't really get unporous until you get to Dr. Johnson in 1755. And Johnson in his dictionary in the preface said, there are those who have asked me to fix the English language. In other words, to say quite clearly, this is in, that's out, and here is how a word should be used. And he goes on to say, but I fear that this is too much for a mere lexicographer. You can't do this, the language is a thing in motion, and it's got a dynamic which we can't tie down. I've done the best with what I can, with my resources, at this time. Interestingly though, it took one Englishman 4 years to do a dictionary. It took 40 Frenchmen nearly 60 years to do theirs. I think that's the right number, and there are a number of people on Shakespeare's side of the channel who are rather keen on pointing to this particular fact. And we won't talk about Brexit. By the way, Brexit has already given a rise to regret, which is regret at Brexit, all right? And Shakespeare would immediately have cottoned onto that, because instead of words being fixed units, words were parts which you could combine and recombine in different ways. And he would have found this entirely appropriate, and would probably have picked it up and used it.
Can I just ask, you talked about the audiences before and the type of language that he used. You said there would be mixed audiences, so there would be people who had learned Latin, but there'd also be the vast masses who had no understanding. The average, for example, the street cleaner or the guy that picked up the compost off the ground or whatever, how much Latin would they have known? How much would they have understood?
Okay, not a lot. Because again, in those days, schooling was much more restricted than it is today. It was for the people who had the money to pay for it. And Shakespeare's father, as a glover in Stratford-on-Avon, had enough to send his son to the local grammar school. But the vast majority of the people were illiterate. So they would have appreciated bits of Shakespeare's plays by allusion, by some words that they'd heard and got some ideas about. A lot of it would have gone right over their heads. But you know, his audiences were everything from the illiterate worked up to the highly literate. And I think he was trying to bracket the lot in some ways. Something for everybody.
There's a trend back to learning Latin again. Latin syllabus is being released. What's your opinion? Should we all, in schools, maybe take up Latin?
Depends on the way it's taught. I was taught Latin as a system of rules to be learnt and translations to be done and errors to be punished. And this never gave us the idea that Latin was a language which could be used for human communication. Now, it is in the Vatican nowadays, but it's about the only place that it is. On the other hand, once you know something about particularly Latin words and word structure, so much of English suddenly snaps into place. And the other one you want, of course, is Greek. But particularly with Latin, because Latin gave the majority of the vocabulary to French, and most of our words come from, if they're not from English, from Latin and French. About 80% of English vocabulary comes from elsewhere. And this is why we are the ultimate mongrel language, because the French are busy. I mean, the Academy, ever since its inception and before in France, has had as a policy statement the purification and the defense of the French, la défense de la langue française, and the defense of the French language. We don't have an academy in English, and we couldn't nowadays. And in fact, the genius of English has been its capacity to suck up words from wherever, to integrate them and to keep on going. Now, as far as Latin and French go, they are the major source of all our abstract vocabulary. All the words in MENT, all the words in AGA, all the words in ISE, except for very recent ones like hospitalised, all come from French or Latin, or both. And so an understanding of Latin gives you a dimension of English which is not available otherwise. If it is taught as a living, interesting language, yes. If it's taught as the way I learnt it, I think it has limited use. But I keep on reusing my Latin now. And I've started learning some more Greek because I don't have enough. But I'll give you an example. In German, the word for heart is Herz. And if you offer someone a hearty greeting, that is herzlich. Hearty, all right? Herzlich. And if you have a heart attack, it's a Herzunfall. So you're using the same root, Herz, in each case. In English, if you offer someone a hearty greeting around a barbie with a beer, that's a hearty greeting. If you go to a cocktail party, it's a cordial greeting with a glass of sherry. And if as a result you have a heart attack, that is a cardiac arrest. And the core bit from cordial comes from Latin and French, and the card bit comes from Greek. And so English has borrowed, if you like, several layers of vocabulary from different places for different purposes. And you have a finger, that's a Germanic word, but what we do with it is digital, and that's Latin. That's why you've got to learn Latin.
Can I just ask a question? You were talking about the evolution of language and the evolution of English and how it's changing all the time. I noticed as a teacher that a lot of children now, instead of saying, "Oh, I had so much fun," they say, "Oh, it's so fun. I had so fun." So they're actually taking some parts of the language out and seemingly simplifying it. And I think a lot of that also is because of iPhones and things like that.
They're repurposing it, but this is an example of conversion. And on your sheets you will find that Shakespeare was well into conversion. And it was so fun, it was so enjoyable, we're making fun into an adjective, whereas it used to be a noun. Okay? And this sort of thing in Shakespeare's usage was entirely acceptable, and he's got lots and lots of them. I've only quoted a few for your enjoyment. They were part of the way he was playing with the language and, in a sense, playing with the audience as well. Here's something a bit different. You haven't heard it before, but come along with me and let's see where it's going. And so his plays and his language were, if you like, a work in progress, plus high-spirited hijinks with the language, occasionally taking significant liberties with the rules such as they were. But because there was so little laid down in terms of the rules of English, he was able to say, well, let's have a play, you know. And, you know, the multitudinous seeds in Carnadine, he's got this great resonant phrase, right? Making the green ones red. Let's have ordinary words now. You know. And again, to be or not to be, that is the question, right? Question is a French word, all the rest are Germanic. Just as in Churchill's famous speech, you know, we shall fight them on the beaches. We shall never surrender. Pretty well the only word from French in that speech is surrender. All the other words are concrete, Germanic, things that we know and relate to. And Churchill was not a linguist, but he knew very well what he was doing. And again, Shakespeare would have appreciated that. He said, you know, he's got the right tone, and here's why. Yeah.
To what extent would you say the position that English enjoys in the modern world is the result of the outcome of the 7 Years' War?
Whoa. There are so many steps between, I honestly don't know. I think that the big fact about English was the fact that after the Second World War, Britain was exhausted, but America spoke English. And I'm quite serious. In 1896, Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany, was asked, what would the dominant country of the 20th century turn out to be? And he said the USA. And he was asked, what is the most single, powerful factor in this dominance? And he said, they speak English.
And if the French had won in North America in the 1750s,
right,
we could well have a political entity speaking French there.
Yes, and La Perouse arrived in Botany Bay 3 days after the settlers set there. The French arrived in Akaroa just before the English, and we could basically have been francophone, but for a very, no seriously, but for a small number of accidents, and possibly the plain bloody-minded resilience of English, which kept going whatever. You know, and it's a lovely point. You know, but I think that the determination of the carriers of English was part of the long-term success of it, and where it's got to today. Stephen.
Thanks, look, thank you very much, Dave. But just to answer a number of questions, but to respond to this gentleman's comment here about in America, with the British speaking French in Canada.
Yeah.
Ejecting France from the whole of the United States, the Americans could then expand right across to the Pacific.
Yep.
And so the whole United States was developed because they beat the French.
Yes.
And that happened as a consequence in 1859 was when the Paris Treaty had instituted. And as a result of that, they had the revolution in America, and they had the revolution in Paris.
Yes.
All as a consequence of that defeat of France.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no doubt that the English language had its root on that battleground in the 1850s.
Okay.
Somebody gave a lecture here about someone gave a lecture about that here a couple of years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, right?
And he always got the centuries wrong.
They got the centuries wrong.
Yeah, right.
The English winning
Yeah.
that war and
Mm-hmm.
winning the world in terms of language
Yeah.
as a consequence.
That could be one of the tipping points.
No.
Yeah.
And the second point is this. I don't want to raise it here. You said that Shakespeare was illiterate.
Mm.
He came out of
Father Shakespeare was possibly illiterate because he signed his sign
exactly right.
name of the cross.
The evidence of that. Then he married Anne Hathaway. He came from the Midlands, went to London, but his genius, if I can say it, he wrote so many things, so many words. Romeo and Juliet was written about in Italy, but he never went there.
No.
He never went there. Isn't this evidence to support the theory that there were a number of people that were writing this, not just Shakespeare, and there were possibly even other people that were writing it?
Mm.
And I often wonder about one person who was often mentioned, Edward de Vere. And I've often wondered whether or not he may have had some role. He was just a wealthy individual who funded these people, whether he funded a whole pile of people to write these plays.
Okay.
Shakespeare was one. Now, that's just a theory. I have no idea.
Okay. De Vere is a
Devil's advocate.
a slightly more plausible possible one, but we don't know enough about him or his other writing. What they have done is they've run computer tests of Shakespeare's language right across the plays to see where there is a consistency of word usage and grammatical usage, the number of adjectives per noun, the number of relative clauses and so on. And it looks very much as if almost all of the Shakespeare we know is of a piece and was written by one person. The other thing I should have mentioned is that at this time, the language of distinguished public discourse was not yet English. Remember that the language of the church was still emerging after Henry VIII. But when the Armada turned up, Elizabeth went down to Tilbury and actually gave an address in English to the troops. And if you do Elizabeth first, address English troops, you'll find the text of it. And she says, I may be a weak woman, but I talk in English and we're going to win. You ought to look at this, because this was the first speech of a British monarch of the rabble-rousing type, which actually turned out to be successful. Now, this is, the language was still finding where it fitted in Shakespeare's day. And the fact that it was after Marlowe and Kidd and then Shakespeare, you could write dignified tragedy in English, which was a genre it hadn't had before. In other words, it gave it, if you like, a resonance which wasn't there. And the fact that Shakespeare covered all this range showed that it could be, if you like, a universal language for the people of the day. The other thing is that I suspect that Shakespeare was a bit of a journalist. No, seriously. He was right in the middle of all sorts of people coming and going around the drama world of London at the time, and I suspect he was just grabbing stories from here and there and everywhere. He was quite literate. He read lots of stuff. He knew lots of stories which he included in the plays. Although there are bits of Romeo and Juliet which look like insider knowledge from someone who's had a better education, the language tells us that it probably was Shakespeare. So he's if you like, being a plagiarist. He's got some ideas from somewhere. But plagiarism in those days was fine. The King James Bible in 1611, King James said to the translators, produce me by whatever means is best, the best Bible that you can. And between 75 and 82% of the King James is actually Tyndale or the previous translators like Coverdale and the Geneva Bible and the Bishop's Bible from the previous century. No problems about plagiarism at all. If it was good, it worked, and they used it.
Your opinion, because I'm assuming you've read the Bible, what do you think of the Tower of Babel, that story, where there was one language and God,
God confounded everybody, yes.
Multiple languages. Now we're seeing this global language emerge.
Well, I mean, from Adam and Eve, you get one line of language, if you like, which spreads out. But God then thought that people were getting a bit cocky, and so he confounded the folks and created the Tower of Babel, and we've got all these different languages. Now, unfortunately, the best understanding of this in linguistics at the moment is that language arose probably once, probably in Africa, probably between 50 and 100,000 years ago, and then spread out everywhere else. And there's all sorts of anthropological and neurological and things relating to your skull and things about this. If that's the case, the 6,900 languages which are still extant and are so different have diversified extraordinarily in a rather short time. Maybe the diversification, God was in there and had a bit of a tweak around about 40,000 years ago. But no, the Tower of Babel is a myth. But it's a lovely myth, and it's one which makes you think. And it's also given rise to some lovely artwork.
Can I just ask, why do you think it is that so many scholars, as you were saying, that all the internet pieces are saying, well, it seems as though all of Shakespeare, or most of Shakespeare's writing was written by one person. Why is it that so many people say it must have been somebody else other than Shakespeare? Why is this sense that, no, Shakespeare couldn't have written it, but somehow De Vere wrote it, or Marlowe, or somebody else wrote it? Why do you think there's this constant feeling that he couldn't have?
I think probably because the volume of top quality original work is so astonishing. One blockbuster play every 6 months. is more than anyone can do nowadays. And he was creating the language as he went. So I think there is a kind of mismatch between the achievement and what our expectation of the capacity of one individual is. But then you look at the evidence that we've got from very careful analysis over 400 years of his vocabulary, his grammar, his, the combinations of sounds, the rhythms and so on. They are too much of a piece. I mean, if there was a ghost writer, the ghost writer was awfully good. And it picked up exactly what Shakespeare would have been saying. So far, the non-Shakespeare arguments are very much a sideline, and people, with the exception of one or two of the plays, which are a bit scrappy at the edges, I think there is a very clear understanding that he probably did it, and we were very lucky that he wrote in English. Should we stop there?
Yes. Well done.
And I apologise for the lack of Hamlet in German and Russian, which I was going to do for you. I will do it on another day, I promise.